In 1960, a wave of political change swept through the African nation of Congo and swept the ruling Belgians out. After more than half a century of colonial oppression, the Congo was finally free. In their first democratic elections, the Congolese voted in Patrice Lumumba, a bold reformer and civil rights activist. The dreams of a hopeful nation were with Lumumba, who promised to bring prosperity and national pride to the Congo.
I think Lumumba was the last great hope for democracy. He was quite a remarkable man.
It's impossible to know Lumumba not to be in awe of him, because even his enemies were in awe of him. He's the type of guy, if you let him speak to you, he'll convince you.
6 months later, triumph turned to tragedy when a group of political rivals captured Lumumba, tortured him, and murdered him. The assassins then dissolved Lumumba's body in a vat of acid.
There was a feeling that he had such charisma, he was such a legendary figure, that they had to destroy all trace of him, because otherwise there was a danger of him becoming, even from beyond the grave, a great rallying force for Congolese nationalism.
Lumumba's death crushed hopes for true freedom and democracy in the Congo, 1 million square miles of the richest land in Africa. Yet despite that wealth, or perhaps because of it, throughout their history, the Congolese would nearly starve to death, economically and politically. Their vast riches would bring only suffering, corruption, and death.
Going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. The air was warm, thick, sluggish. There was no joy in the brilliance of sunshine.
When prize-winning author Joseph Conrad wrote his novella Heart of Darkness, a journey into the terrifying depths of man's soul, he turned to the cruelest place on earth for inspiration, the Congo. It wasn't the Congo's inhabitants that made it that way. It was a ruthless succession of outsiders, beginning with Leopold II, a Belgian king with a lust for wealth and a passion for murder.
Leopold was a very frustrated man as the king of a small country. And he had the conviction that to be worth anything in the world, a country had to have colonies. And he was a very single-minded man about that.
King Leopold ascended the Belgian throne in 1865. 9 years later, an American explorer and journalist captivated the world with his stories of peril and pursuit in the farthest reaches of Africa. His name was Henry Morton Stanley.
Stanley had discovered this area, which was the Congo, essentially, and he came back to Europe with the tales of what he'd seen there, the riches, the natural abundance, the ivory, the rubber, the gum, the palms, the trees, the timber, and this got someone very excited. It basically excited King Leopold of Belgium, and he thought, that's what I want.
Leopold was eager for his own piece of the African pie, which was being sliced up into colonies by other European powers, but he had no idea where to start. So in 1878, Leopold turned to Stanley, hoping the experienced explorer could help him take over the Congo. He did. 1 year later, Stanley was back in Africa as King Leopold's agent. He approached the Congo's tribal chiefs with land treaties and tricked over 500 of them into signing.
Obviously, they couldn't read, they didn't know what it meant, and they sold their birthrights for a few beads. It basically meant that they were handing over the rights to their land and the rights to trade, and they were handing that control over to King Leopold. Because what was extraordinary about the Congo was that it wasn't, at the beginning, a Belgian colony. It was essentially personal property of King Leopold II.
While Stanley was in Africa, gobbling up a region 80 times the size of Belgium, Leopold was back in Brussels figuring out how to make his gamble pay off. In 1879, Leopold created a private company whose stated mission was to free the Congolese people from foreign oppressors, namely Arab slave traders who were kidnapping native villagers and selling them into slavery abroad. Leopold assured the world his regime, which he called the Congo Free State, would bring prosperity and fair trade to the Congo. This, he said publicly, was the humanitarian thing to do, but his true goals were far different.
Well, he didn't believe in free trade. He didn't care at all for the indigenous population. He had absolutely no humanitarian ideals whatsoever. His aim was to create a colony for Belgium and make money.
In 1887, a discovery made half a world away would be Leopold's lucky break. Scotsman John Dunlop developed a useful and inexpensive way to revolutionize travel: rubber tires. The Congo was one of only a handful of places in the world where rubber grew wild, and Leopold acted quickly to exploit it. He formed the Force Publique, an army of Belgians and Africans, and got them to force Congolese natives into rubber harvesting. It was dangerous work and required scaling the tops of trees where the valuable vines hung. Leopold's rush to corner the world's rubber market led to a whole new form of slavery in the Congo, and a reign of terror so brutal it would become the worst genocide in African history. It began with a hard leather whip called a chicotte.
They would use the chicotte to punish a Congolese villager who hadn't met his quota, and the chicotte basically flayed open the skin, so that apparently after 20 strokes you were a bloody pulp. And if you had the misfortune to have 50 strokes or 100 strokes, you died. So it became synonymous with Leopold's rule, and it was a horrible, feared instrument of torture.
But to the outside world, the Congo seemed like a perfect colony, profitable, productive, and civilized, all thanks to King Leopold. Meanwhile, inside the Congo, things went from bad to worse. When the rubber workers inevitably collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, or disease, the Force Publique shot them and were ordered to cut off their hands.
The Force Publique were issued with bullets, and the officers who were commanding these mercenaries wanted to see results. So for one of these soldiers not to get punished, if he was sent out with 10 cartridges, he had to have 10 hands of his victims. It's proof that he hadn't wasted his bullets. Often, of course, some of these bullets had been wasted, so there was this extraordinary pictures you get of living Congolese who, while they were still alive, had had their hands severed. Leopold set new standards in colonial brutality. I think he did that because he just was a man in a great hurry, and he didn't think of the Congolese as human.
Few statistics were collected at the time, but estimates put the total number of murdered Congolese at well over 10 million. By 1901, the Congo was one of the world's largest rubber suppliers, and King Leopold profited handsomely. He lived the high life in Belgium and in several chateaux and villas throughout Europe.
Leopold never set foot in what was ironically known as the Congo Free State, and I think that made it easier for him. He could not look face to face with the evidence of what he had done to that country.
This big propaganda ploy really managed to disguise what was really happening in Africa, and King Leopold was able to get away with it. He was able to kill millions, but still pretend that he was civilizing millions.
Leopold might have prolonged his terror campaign had it not been for a curious and determined clerk in a Liverpool shipping office. His name was Edmund Morel.
Morel looked at the shipping manifests and discovered that while a great deal of rubber and ivory was coming from the Congo, practically nothing was going back. The main items which were carried in the ships going from Antwerp to the Congo were arms and ammunition, which obviously weren't going to be supplied to the Congolese. So that struck him as extremely suspicious.
Once he suspected foul play, Morel was a man possessed. He quit his job and spent the next decade investigating King Leopold's corrupt regime.
Morel was extraordinarily accurate. He was very adept at reading into this sort of boring statistics how much was coming out of the Congo in terms of resources. He would get documents leaked to him by people within Leopold's administration, people who did have consciences, who were concerned at what was going on.
It was a moral issue, I think, for him. There was a robbery going on a grand scale, and he disapproved.
And Morel wasn't the only one watching the Congo. A British diplomat also issued a stinging indictment of King Leopold's system of slave labor, warning it would lead to the total extinction of the Congolese people. Faced with world suspicion, Leopold defiantly proclaimed, "I will not allow myself to be soiled by blood or mud," and began an ambitious counter-campaign.
He would bribe journalists, he would bribe US senators. He would invite people to go to the Congo and would make sure that while they were in the Congo, they only saw the nicest possible aspect of what was going on. So for every step that Morel took, King Leopold was up there meeting it and trying to neutralize it.
But in 1902, a profound literary work added its voice to the growing chorus against Leopold. Author Joseph Conrad worked as a sea captain's apprentice on the Congo River in 1890, during the height of the rubber massacres. Conrad was so transformed by the brutality and death he witnessed that he wrote it all down, and it became the basis for his seminal work, Heart of Darkness.
Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair.
He was talking about the darkness which is at the heart of Westerners, white men who go out to places like Africa, and because they are far from their family, their friends, and the strictures of the society in which they have been brought up, they start behaving in ways that would have been inconceivable if they were back home.
They were dying slowly. It was very clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation, lying confusedly in the greenish gloom.
Conrad intended it to be an absolute blast aimed at the imperialist, colonialist system that had been set up in the Congo and the imperialist Congolese system that was being applied across Africa at that time.
By 1908, the Belgian government was forced to confront the mounting claims of an African Holocaust. To stem public outrage, it took the colony away from Leopold. The aging king was surprisingly relieved. Rubber sales had suddenly collapsed, and Leopold believed his days of fortune hunting in the Congo were over. By the time the Belgians stripped Leopold of his personal colony, his massive fortune was safely secured in a Swiss bank account.
There's a common myth that once Leopold handed over the Congo to Belgium itself, that things improved enormously and it was fine, and for the average Congolese, living standards improved and they were treated as human beings. In fact, the difference was really not that obvious. And while rubber had become of no importance, the Belgians discovered that there was huge mineral resources under the soil. In Congo, there was copper, gold. So the system of forced labor went from being applied to rubber to being applied to mineral resources.
The Belgians renamed the country the Belgian Congo and ruled for the next 50 years. They boasted to the world of their help for the Congolese people and built churches, medical clinics, and elementary schools.
Yes, in the Congo, other seeds have taken root. Seeds that can one day reach a full maturity.
But there was a limit to how much the Congolese could achieve. Under Belgian rule, no native could vote, There was no system of higher education for blacks, and by 1956, among the 15 million people, there were just 17 college graduates.
The Belgians had a motto, which was, if you keep the African ignorant and not educated, he won't present a potential problem. So they deliberately didn't encourage the Congolese to go very far in their education. It was all part of these savages are not ready to run themselves, this very patronizing approach of they need to be looked after. They're like children.
They are a simple people, and to them it's all a little strange, to say the least. They need understanding, patience, sympathy.
The way Belgium was able to maintain the colonial structure during the Congo-Belge, during the Belgian-Congo period, was through this colonization of the mind, that the white man is a better human being than the black man. And they pumped that message into the population through all forms of education, even in churches. And the people became sort of subdued and colonized internally in their mind.
But in the late 1950s, that changed. After decades of European rule, Africans across the continent began demanding equal rights and independence. Revolts in colonial strongholds like Algeria and South Africa made the Belgians fear an uprising in their own colony. In 1960, after more than 50 years of domination and exploitation, Belgium abruptly pulled out of the Congo, leaving it a free country without a government. The Congolese acted quickly to elect their first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba vowed to shake off the Congo's colonial shackles and establish freedom and order.
Nous allons commencer une nouvelle lutte, une lutte sublime qui va mener notre pays à la paix, à la prospérité et à la grandeur. Nous allons établir ensemble la justice sociale et assurer que chacun reçoive la juste rémunération de son travail.
But all was not well in the new regime. Not all Congolese accepted Lumumba, and from his very first day in office, a military mutiny and revolt in Congo's richest province of Katanga threatened his rule. Without sufficient military strength to contain the hostilities, Lumumba sought temporary help from abroad. But 1960 was the peak of the Cold War, and tensions ran high between superpowers the United States and Soviet Union. After the US refused to get involved in the Congo, Lumumba turned to Moscow for military support. Once he did, the US branded Lumumba a communist.
At his White House press conference, President Eisenhower reads a prepared statement.
The United States deplores the unilateral action of the Soviet Union in supplying aircraft and other equipment for military purposes to the Congo, which seems to be motivated entirely by the Soviet Union's political designs in Africa.
Lumumba insisted he wasn't communist and proclaimed independence from both superpowers, but it was too late.
Washington thought this man is a threat, we don't want Congo to go communist, and really we would rather he was out of the way. America definitely wanted him killed. The CIA had drawn up plans to do that, but in the end they didn't have to.
In December 1960, Lumumba was arrested by Joseph Mobutu, a defense minister with secret ties to the United States. When Lumumba was imprisoned, tortured, and killed, it was at the hands of his countrymen, but there was little doubt of foreign involvement.
Assassination. The Senate report on the CIA.
Good evening. The Senate Intelligence Committee tonight released its long-awaited report on political assassinations. It confirms the worst. The report said there is sufficient evidence to infer that President Eisenhower may have authorized an attempt on Lumumba's life in 1960.
Lumumba's murder made an already uncertain future disastrous. For 5 years, the Congo was racked by violence, civil war, and chaos. In the middle of it all, waiting for a chance to seize power, was Joseph Mobutu. That chance came in 1965. With the Congo desperate for leadership, Mobutu declared himself president.
He was a good behind-the-scenes player. He was bright. He had managed to position himself well in the military. He had excellent relations with the Belgians and with the Americans, and it was easy for him to project himself as the unifier and the one who would better serve the interests of the former colonial power and eventually the United States.
While outwardly Mobutu nodded to U.S. interests, at home he assured the Congolese people he would restore honor and prosperity to their struggling nation.
This is a young idealist who comes to power, thinks he's doing the right thing. It's the movement about saving Congo from oppression, from the colonial yoke. Those of us who grew up under Mobutu, we had a great sense of our own identity. Congolese, Zaïrois, a great sense of pride.
A charismatic leader, Mobutu's personal style was native chic. He was obsessed with leopards and laid leopard skin rugs all over his sprawling palace. He owned 7 different spotted hats, which became his trademark. Mobutu also launched a very public campaign to revive Congolese culture. He began by changing the name of the country to Zaire, and then by changing his own name.
It was part of a drive to rediscover his African roots and Congo's African roots, and reject Western influences and say, this is our nation. We are masters of our fate. So he stopped being known as Joseph Désiré Mobutu, and he used to call himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kukumbandu Wazabanga, which means the cockerel that goes from chicken to chicken, from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake.
But Mobutu didn't stop there. Once he had a taste of power, he was hooked.
People would wear Mobutu on their body, these shirts that had his face, and they would chant their songs of praise.
Next thing you know, church hymns are being translated into Mobutu's hymn. And I'm meaning literally, where it says God, they say Mobutu.
But for the majority of Congolese citizens, life was better than it had been under the Belgians. Copper replaced rubber as the mainstay of Zaire's economy, and the country thrived. Mobutu showed his people how great they could be, and then he showed the world. In 1974, he invited sports heroes Muhammad Ali and George Foreman to Zaire for their famous boxing match, Rumble in the Jungle.
The fight was all about promoting Congo, Zaire. This was a country to reckon with, Africa all over the world. A leader who decides, I'm going to put not Congo just in the African map, I'm going to put Congo on the world's map. Everybody will know where Congo is.
The world saw a new Zairean stadium and once-in-a-lifetime boxing match. What they didn't see was a careful facade erected by Mobutu in the weeks before the event. Wanting to ensure the foreign press and dignitaries got the best impression of his new Zaire, Mobutu reportedly rounded up hundreds of the city's delinquents. Without charge or trial, they were thrown in a jail cell rumored to be right beneath the seats in the same stadium where the boxing match was held.
Mobutu put into place a totalitarian system of control that in so many ways affected the life of every citizen. And awful things could happen every day of the week, but as long as you're exporting this massive quantity of primary resources, you can still use that money to grease the wheels and to soften the resistance around the country. And that's something that Mobutu was really able to do into the 1970s because of the copper prices.
But what Mobutu boasted in charm and patriotism, he lacked in experience. When the copper market collapsed, Zaire's economy imploded.
The CIA station chief, who knew Mobutu very well, said he was politically brilliant, but he was an economic spastic. All he knew was how a tribal chief operates. And a tribal chief operates by handing out presents, by keeping the loyalty of his subjects, by handing out envelopes full of cash.
With the economy in shambles, Mobutu needed money to stay in power and maintain his loyalties. But he had no idea how to make it, so he decided to steal it, creating a system of fraud at the highest level of government that became known as kleptocracy.
A kleptocrat is somebody who just can't stop picking things up that don't belong to him, and I do think it's a pretty accurate description of Mobutu. He needed to have a cut of everything. Any company that operated in Congo in those years was paying off the president. And if that's what the boss is doing, that's what all the underlings do as well. So there was this insidious culture of corruption that spread right down to every layer of society. So it was rotten through, right down to the core.
Even Mobutu's own army was denied a salary and was forced to operate primarily through bribes.
The army was busy trying to survive on the back of the population. This is the legacy of Mobutu. They are not paid salaries. And during Mobutu's time, this was a system of government. And that's why the term kleptocracy was coined. Rule through theft, rule through corruption.
Mobutu was spinning out of control, but there was no one inside the Congo able to stop him, and no one outside willing to. During Mobutu's reign, $3 billion in Western aid flowed into the Congo.
The West's support was basically premised on the entire rationale of the Cold War years, which is, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard. And we can't afford to lose a big, potentially influential country like Congo. We can't afford for it to go to communist. So let's keep in his good books, let's keep paying him the money that he wants, even though we know he's stealing it.
It was a cruel game. Everyone knew exactly what they wanted out of it. He was using them, they were using him, and both were happy about it. And both were responsible for the suffering, the tremendous suffering of the Congolese that continues to this date.
By the mid-1980s, Mobutu's rule went from corrupt to deadly. Thousands of Congolese were dying from record rates of starvation, malnutrition, and preventable disease. Child mortality rates were among the highest in Africa. Average income was just $150 per year. One villager remarked that the only businesses doing well in the Congo were coffin makers. While the wealth from Congo's natural resources could have easily met the population's needs, most of it never reached them. Instead, profits from gold, diamonds, and cobalt went straight into Mobutu's Swiss bank account. In 1986, his net worth was estimated at $4 billion, a sum that, had he applied it to his own country, would have wiped out its entire national debt.
I think Mobutu has acquired a terrible reputation for brutality, but to my mind, he should be vilified for a completely different reason, which is that he destroyed the hopes and dreams of every Congolese by destroying their economy. And I think the damage he did his people, every single level of society was affected by the fact that he destroyed that economy.
Stories again leaked out to the world about exploitation in the Congo, this time not by a greedy Belgian monarch, but by one of their own.
We can look at him and see a straight line from King Leopold through to Mobutu of exploiters who extracted the wealth of the country and used it for their own purposes in a way that didn't benefit the country. One other thing about Mobutu is that he did create unity, but the unity that emerged in the last decades of his rule was unity in opposition, unity in oppression, unity in struggle.
But although internal opposition grew, it would take outside events to finally change things inside the Congo. In 1994, a bloody genocide in neighboring Rwanda had grave consequences for Mobutu. Rwanda's Tutsi tribal force arrived in the Congo in pursuit of their Hutu enemies who were hiding out there. Once in the Congo, like others before them, the Tutsis became lured by the prospect of mineral wealth and decided to stay.
The Rwandans discovered coltan, coltan being the most important mineral we use for all our electronics. So cell phones, computers, video games, anywhere from 70 to 90% of coltan is found in Congo. So again, here we are. Resources of Congo is still the main obstacle to Congo's knowing peace.
On May 16, 1997, a small group of Congolese rebels, joined by the Rwandan Tutsis, took over the capital and toppled Mobutu. After 32 years as Zaire, the country was renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was neither democratic nor a republic. Instead, at the end of the century, the Congo was as it had been at the beginning of the century, a sad, brutally violent place, controlled by outsiders.
One slogan you heard a lot in your civics class was, "Nous voulons être ce que nous voulons." We want to be what we want to be. We don't want to be what others want us to be. Congo is the classic case where total outside interference just jams every speck of progress. Why can't you let us solve our own issues? Give us a chance. We never got a chance, and I think that's really the sad part. A nation is not born when everybody's trying to stifle it. Give us a chance, let us breathe.